All right. Hello, everyone. My name's Guy. I'm from the University of Melbourne, and I'm here on behalf of the team of editors of this book, Daniel Nordgård from University of Adger in Kristiansand, Norway, and Peter Tschmuck, who's at University of Music and Performing Arts, Vienna. So in this presentation, we introduce our recently published contributed volume, Rethinking the Music Business, Music Context, Rights Data, and COVID-19. We do this by first outlining the challenges of designing, writing, and editing a research-based book during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we'll explain why part one features 6 chapters that concern the impact of the COVID pandemic on the music business, while part 2 is comprised of 6 chapters that present original insights into the music business in general. And we edited this book in solidarity with the various authors who managed to contribute chapters to this volume, despite COVID-19 related disruptions and time out from work due to illness. And we also edited this book in solidarity with all of the participants who contributed to our own research projects that feature in this book, and with the participants who took part in our contributing authors' research projects. So our aim in this book was to provide a holistic picture of the music business, or as holistic as we could at this time, by gathering contributions from authors who are in the United Kingdom, Austria, Zimbabwe, Germany, India, Australia, Norway, and the Philippines during the COVID-19 pandemic. So in writing, designing and editing this book, we encountered several challenges. And of course, bringing together a diverse group of scholars and case studies to present a global perspective on the music business during the COVID-19 pandemic meant that several contributing authors and editors contracted COVID-19 during this time, and some of the team behind the book are still suffering from long COVID. And the pandemic has made many things more challenging, including the creation of this book. Yet despite this, our contributing authors rose to the challenge, and we managed to submit the book to our publisher roughly on time. And likewise, much of the music business itself has stopped and started and adapted and evolved during this time. And it's been fascinating to see how innovation and creativity have been harnessed to regenerate and rethink the music business. And this juxtaposition between the catastrophe of the ongoing COVID-19 disaster and business as usual also informed the design of this book. Indeed, another challenge we faced in compiling this book concerned how we could consider some of the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis on the music business, as well as pre-existing trends in the business that were not directly impacted by this crisis, and research that was conducted prior to the pandemic. And to provide as holistic a picture of the music business during this time as possible, we resolved to split the book evenly into 2 parts. And part 1 features 6 chapters that concern the impact of COVID on the business, while part 2 is comprised of chapters that concern the business in general. And I'll just speak to part 1 here due to time. So it may be years before we can understand the true impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the music business, because we're not able to zoom out far enough at this time, as it still encircles us and threatens to suffocate us. So in part 1, our contributing authors have only been able to zoom in to analyse some key issues. And that was yet another challenge of doing this book at this time. The question of, was it too early? Is it too early? And in some senses, yes, it is, because you need that longer term view. But of course, there are still insights that we can glean in the short term. So the first chapter in the book by George Musgrave is entitled Losing Work, Losing Purpose, Representations of Musicians' Mental Health in the Time of COVID. And in chapter 2, Musgrave examines media representations of musicians' mental health during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United Kingdom. The media narratives that emerged from these many representations are his specific concern, and Musgrave traces 2 primary ones. The first relates to employment anxiety and the loss of income, while the second concerns musicians' loss of purpose and thus the existential anxiety faced by many musicians. While Musgrave does not claim that musicians' mental health concerns were worse than those of other members of British society during this time, he does argue that his work here is significant because the live music industry and the music industries in general, because the various sectors are very interconnected, was one of the hardest hit by the pandemic-related lockdowns. And live music venues were amongst the first to close and the last to open. And Musgrave's discussion of musicians' eligibility or lack thereof for the self-employment income scheme in the UK leads him to consider the particularly poignant question of the economic viability of musicianship and whether, on average, musical work has ever been economically viable. So in chapter 3, continuing with a similar theme, Tschmuck et al. Examine the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on freelance classical musicians in Austria. And they do this by working through the results of an online survey they conducted with 1,777 participants. And they found that the classical musicians who participated in their study suffered less than musicians in other music genres. They argue that this is because these musicians often combine their freelance work as musicians with fixed-term work for orchestras and work teaching music than musicians who work in other music genres do. And while they claim that almost all musicians suffered pandemic-related income losses, and the points Musgrave made in chapter 2 about musicians' mental health are no doubt also relevant to classical musicians, when they introduced gender into their analysis, Tschmuck et al. Found that the pandemic has so far had a different impact on the income situation of women and men. At a first glance, it seems that female artists suffered less from the pandemic than male artists. In relative terms, however, they found that women often lost more than men, despite men having higher absolute income losses than women. Yet female classical musicians were better off than women working in popular music genres in Austria. So in chapter 4, Oliver and Lalchev examined digital transformation in the music industry and the question of how the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated new business opportunities. Using secondary data, they mapped the territory to uncover new phenomena and identify emerging patterns of behaviour within the music business. And they identify 5 key trends that illustrate how COVID-19 has forced practitioners to rethink the music business. And these are the evolution of creators, the social audio platforms, the metaverse, blockchain and non-fungible tokens, and the evolution of streaming. And they argue that even though digitization has been changing the music business landscape for years prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, new trends that emerged within a period of less than 2 years because of the pandemic accelerating these numerous new business opportunities was quite profound. And overall, they conclude that the pandemic created a perfect storm for the music business, which in turn led to this business putting much of its resourcing and attention into the digital domain. And with only 2 years, the pandemic has been a catalyst for creative and innovative output that ordinarily might have taken a whole decade. In chapter 5, Victoria uses social capital theory to examine the strategies 3 Zimbabwean female musicians used to manage their careers during the COVID-19 pandemic. Drawing on her doctoral research into the government's role in Zimbabwe's live music sector, Victoria uses a case study approach and analyses data gathered through in-depth semi-structured interviews and document analysis. And her overarching finding is that the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the 3 Zimbabwean female musicians differently and in both positive and negative ways. She notes that overall, the loss of live music performance opportunities had negative economic, social and cultural impacts. And this forced her participants to regenerate their human capital by learning new skills. She argues that this learning process augmented their extant social capital and enhanced their proficiency by creating new COVID-19 friendly networks. She claims that her participants utilised their cognitive bonding, bridging, linking, relational and structural forms of social capital to exploit and expand existing networks, and that therefore social capital sustained the 3 Zimbabwean musicians who participated in her study by allowing them access to economic, cultural, and symbolic capital during the pandemic. So in chapter 6, Blunk et al. Explore the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on live music venues in Germany. And they ask the questions, how did COVID-19 and related measures to reduce contact impact live music venues in Germany? Was the cultural value or the social value of live music particularly affected, and how? What are the likely long-term consequences for the live music sector? And to answer these questions, they conducted exploratory research during the northern summer of 2020. And this included 14 semi-structured interviews with key actors in the live music sector, for example, club owners, politicians, live music associations. And their findings indicate that music venues are confronted with an existential crisis that exceeds their economic pressures. This includes venues in Germany facing the loss of informal support networks within the sector and decreasing ties between artists, venues, and audiences. Besides economic effects, they identified 3 areas of impact that the situation caused by COVID had on cultural value. These are the obstruction of musical creativity and co-creation, general cultural lethargy and disruption of talent development. They also identified 3 areas of impact on social value: loss of communal experience, loss of voices in political discourse, and decreased potential for identity formation. And their work here is significant as it highlights the importance of live music events as social places and spaces, and the importance of venues to the live music ecology. So in chapter 7, which concludes part 1 of the book, Rain et al. Examine how 4 jazz festivals across the UK adapted their processes and practices to rethink jazz festivals during the COVID-19 pandemic. And they explore themes such as pandemic-exposed fragilities, community resilience in the face of adversity, and industry recovery. And Rain et al. Provide a fascinating insider's perspective into the jazz scene during this time by using their own reflexive positionalities. Each of them has built a scholarly career on a personal and pre-existing passion. 2 of them are also performing musicians, and one of them is the director of the board for the Edinburgh Jazz and Blues Festival. And their positioning as both scholars and musicians participants makes this chapter particularly poignant, I thought. It was written in solidarity with their participants who gave up their time to discuss a traumatic period in their lives and to share their experiences and potential lessons with others. And these lessons include understandings of the challenges and opportunities that arose through the shift to virtual live music experiences, the potential longevity of economic models developed during the COVID-19 pandemic, changing relationships with audiences, musicians, and funders, and changes in the role of jazz festivals in society. So that's part 1. Part 2, which I won't speak to now apart from this brief overview, is to say that it contains 6 chapters that present original insights into the music business in general. And this book was, this part of the book was designed to enable research concerning areas of the music business that weren't directly impacted, and also research that was conducted prior to the crisis to be honoured, in a sense, in terms of method, and giving that a voice and a space in this body of research as well. So in conclusion, we'd like to echo Rain et al.'s sentiments in chapter 7 above here and note that we edited this book in solidarity with the various authors who managed to contribute chapters to this volume despite COVID-19 related disruptions. And we also edited this book in solidarity with the various participants who helped generate it. And our contributing authors were in the United Kingdom, Austria, Zimbabwe, Germany, India, Australia, Norway, and the Philippines during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this enabled us to attempt to provide a holistic picture of the music business at this time. And as stated at the start of this presentation, we designed this book to address the juxtaposition between the catastrophe of the ongoing COVID-19 disaster and business as usual. Yet not much seems to be as usual in the new normal we find ourselves living in. the COVID-19 pandemic has had such a pervasive impact on the music business that even pre-existing trends in this business that were not directly impacted by this crisis have in many ways still been impacted indirectly. And to provide as holistic a picture of the music business as possible in this book, it was necessary that research not affected by the pandemic, because it was conducted prior to 2020 in March, needed to be presented alongside this post-2020 content. And this research we've collated in this book is significant because it enables us to better understand the cultural, social, and economic value of music before, during, and during the COVID-19 pandemic, but not after it. This is because at the time of writing, we're still living through this crisis. And as we stated above, it may be years before we can understand the true impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the music business. We're simply not able to zoom out far enough at this time. And so obviously future research is needed into the longer term impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on the music business. Thank you very much.